All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Thomas L. Rhodes, journalism fellow at National Review and a host of the American Institute for Economic Research's E-Conception podcast, Dominic Pino. Welcome to the economy, Dominic.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Uh, so first up, what's going on in Congress? So are we going to get this Trump-approved reconciliation bill that extends the 2017 tax cuts? Uh, because Trump has said he wants a a big bill that extends all the Tax Cuts and Job Act tax cuts from 2017, but he also wants a bunch of other stuff like border security and Pentagon funding and the debate for even before Congress started was whether this is all going to happen in one big bill or two or even three or different bills. And then at a certain point, they sort of like ended that speculation because Trump said, "Oh, we want one big beautiful bill," or some Trumpish thing that he said, with the exact I forget the exact phrasing. So everyone said, "Oh, I guess the president wants one bill, so I guess it's going to happen." But then we hear more stuff out of the Senate leadership, and they say, "Oh, well, maybe we'll do two bills." And so, Dominic? What's going to happen?
Your guess is as good as mine, Richard. The issue with Congress right now is primarily that the House of Representatives has a very, very small Republican majority, and so it's very difficult for them to do much of anything. I think the timeline that Speaker Johnson has laid out, where he basically thinks they're going to have this whole thing wrapped up by May, I think that is probably not going to happen. I think it's going to take longer than that. If you remember in 2017, when the tax cuts were passed the first time, it took all the way until the end of December to get it done. That is the deadline that they have right now for the expiration of the tax cuts is December 31st. And so if they can wait all the way until then without ever having to see taxes go up. I do think that the tax cuts will be ultimately will be extended in some form. It's just a question of what that will actually look like. Um, the problem that they'll have for budget scoring purposes is that because this is done through reconciliation, it doesn't have to pass the filibuster in the Senate, which is why they're doing it that way. But it also means that it's not allowed to impact deficits outside of the 10-year budget window. And so it's going to be difficult, to put it lightly, for them to make the tax cuts permanent, which is, I know, what a lot of Republicans want to do. What they might end up doing is extending them for a set amount of time. So basically setting up this exact situation to happen again in 5 years or in 7 years or 8 years or something like that. The other thing that they have is that they're not just trying to extend the tax cuts that are already there. They're also trying to add some new ones. Donald Trump wants to have no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security. A lot of these things would be expensive if they were actually done for everyone. There are ways you can make them basically free because they really wouldn't apply to anyone. So you could say, you get no tax on tips, but cap it at income of say $40,000 a year or something like that. People making $40,000 a year because of other deductions and benefits that already exist, they're not really paying income tax anyway. So making making their tips not subject to taxation wouldn't actually make any difference. But if you're gonna if you're gonna claim it as a win because it didn't make a difference for anyone, then that doesn't really make much sense either. So yeah, the political math is very hard for them just because the majority is so small. And look, the Senate majority is only 3 seats as well. So it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, but proportionally, that three seat seems like a luxury compared to the House.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the no tax on Social Security proposal, and that is something that all of the smart folks, including our previous guest Erica York, the Tax Foundation, other people have said, well, you can't do changes to Social Security through the reconciliation process. Because the budget rules say you can't, specifically single out say you can't make changes to Social Security like that, and that's the only way to pass this with 51 votes rather than 60 votes. So that at least seems like, unless they, I don't know, keep the Senate parliamentarian gagged in the basement or something, that they're at least not going to get that, even if they manage to squeak out everything else.
Yeah, it could be. It could still be hung up over this tax on tips thing, and then the other thing too is the state and local tax deduction, which was capped in 2017 by the Trump tax cuts last time, and they capped it at $10,000 per tax filer, which for most people is plenty of money. There are very few people, relatively speaking, who pay more than $10,000 a year in state and local taxes in the United States. The people who do, though, are primarily concentrated in congressional districts where Republicans have very small majorities to work with. And those congressional districts, you could argue, are the ones that have made the House majority. And so it's going to be very difficult to get um, to pass any bill without listening to those folks. And what they're asking for is for that cap to be raised or to be removed entirely to go back to what the tax code was like before 2017. So that's another issue that they're going to have to deal with. And there's about five members of the House that said that this is a deal breaker for them, that they need that cap to be raised, and five is enough, right? With a majority as small as they have.
Right. So that looks like it's going to be a tight fight. Now, looking from Capitol Hill to the White House, the administration, we've gotten to the point where we've mostly staffed up the senior levels of the new administration. Top appointees, cabinet members have been confirmed. And so I want to get your lightning round reaction to these folks. So I've got my list in front of me, and I think I've got most of them down here. So, give me what do you think? They're a good pick or a bad pick, or what, anything they've been doing so far. A bunch of them have made uh, not non-trivial headlines just in the short amount of time they've been in office. And if there's anyone you don't want to talk about, just pass. Game show. Okay. First up, Scott Bessent at Treasury.
Not great, not great. I think he doesn't really have very much of a record of being a free market guy or even of being a Republican. I mean, he was a Democratic donor for a long time. He's affiliated with George Soros, who of course funds lots of different progressive ideological projects, and he seems to have been very successful in the last couple years of just ingratiating himself to Trump and sort of projecting himself as the smart, sophisticated proponent of tariffs and of some other different economic policies, and seems to have worked his way into Trump's good graces by doing that. And we've seen last couple of weeks him talking about how tariffs aren't going to raise prices, but they might actually because but the short term pain will be worth it because in the long term it'll work out great, even though the stock market doesn't think that, and all the people with actual money on the line, which he would know because this is he's a Wall Street guy, this is his background. But he pretends he doesn't know that in order to continue to be in Trump's good graces, which, you could argue is his job as the Secretary of the Treasury, but he also chose to do this. So I do think it's legitimate to criticize him for it. And then, the stuff about how cheap goods aren't part of the American dream, he says. And
Oh wait, we'll get
he
into
said,
that. We'll get into that. I got a whole other question about that.
all right, sure.
Okay, moving on. Marco Rubio, State.
Yeah, overall pretty good. He it was you felt bad for him during the the address to the joint session of Congress. Trump was basically just making fun of him up there, saying he got confirmed unanimously, even though the Democrats voted for him, and that made Trump a little suspicious of him and things like that. But no, I think Rubio is overall a good pick. I think it's good that we have a Spanish speaking Secretary of State. We haven't had that. And I think it will be good. Hopefully, he'll be able to mend some of our relationships in this hemisphere because those have been languishing really since the George W. Bush administration. Both Obama and Trump the first time really didn't, and then Biden as well really have not put much emphasis on Latin America. So I'm hoping that we will get back to that, but. The tariff and trade stuff causes problems there because that is a big chunk of those countries' trade, and a big chunk of our trade is right here. So it would be good to be able to build on those relationships instead of having the president be undermining them.
Okay, maybe renewed good neighbor policy. Pam Bondi at Justice.
I don't know a ton about her. And I don't know a ton about exactly what's going on with the Justice Department. It's not really my area, but she's certainly better than Matt Gaetz. I'll tell you that. That was a step up, definitely. It was good to see Republicans in the Senate at least have enough of just barely the semblance of a backbone to kill that nomination before it even got to the floor. So that was good, but yeah, I'm really not sure exactly what the details are.
Okay. Doug Burgum, Interior.
Yeah, I'm a Burgum fan. I liked him in the primaries. He was a fantastic governor of North Dakota overall. Very popular there too. He won like 70% of the vote, which, it is a red state, but it's not that red of a state. So he really does well there. He's a very smart guy. A lot of the deregulation stuff that they're trying to do, selling off federal land, would be great as well. The federal government owns way too much land. There's no reason for it. This isn't about national parks or whatever. We should leave those alone. But this is about, vast quantities of land which are not national parks. They're not, wildlife preserves. They're just owned by the federal government really for no reason. We should definitely sell those off. So I'm glad that he's on that. He's also a big proponent of pipeline construction because as governor of North Dakota, you realize how important pipeline infrastructure is, and where it doesn't exist, it causes real problems. And so he's a good I think spokesman for deregulating energy and making energy more abundant and cheap.
All right. Speaking of which, how about Lee Zeldin at EPA?
Yeah, no, another good pick, another good start there. EPA, they really seem to be taking seriously the deregulation efforts, and I'm hoping that they will be even more successful than the first Trump administration. The first Trump administration, they ran up against some problems, and the initial pick there had to leave over some ethics concerns and things like that. So I'm hoping that Zeldin will be much better on that front, and hopefully will be able to successfully get the EPA off the backs of American businesses.
All right. How about Chris Wright at Energy?
This is my favorite. This is my favorite of all the picks. I'm a big Chris Wright fan. I wrote about it at National Review that this was Trump's best cabinet pick. He was the CEO of Liberty Energy, which is a oilfield services fracking company, and they do this great thing. Instead of putting out ESG reports every year, they put out Bettering Human Lives reports, and they illustrate how their product, which is cheap fossil fuels, actually makes people's lives better, and the ways in which that has happened for people all over the world, not just in the United States, and really especially for people outside the United States, because we're already the wealthiest people in the world. It's the world's poor people who need access to energy, need access to the uplift that energy brings to them. And the United States can play a big role in making that happen because of our abundant natural resources. And so I think Wright totally understands that. He actually has firsthand experience doing this. And I think he's a perfect pick for this role.
All right. So we love Chris Wright. What about Lori Chavez de Remer at Labor?
Yeah, so this is at least in policy terms, this was the worst. This was the worst pick. She would have been a good token Republican in a Kamala Harris administration. It used to be a tradition, sort of. You'd pick one extremely squishy member of the other party to be in your cabinet as a nice, Biden didn't do that. Trump didn't do that the first time either. So that tradition has kind of gone away. But Chavez DeRemer would have been that person in a Kamala Harris administration because she was one of the only Republicans in the House of Representatives to support both the PRO Act, which was a bill that private sector unions wanted, and then the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act, which was a public sector union bill, which is even more anathema to Republicans than private sector unions. And she supported both of these. She basically has just said, "Oh, I don't really think that anymore." It hasn't really explained why, other than the fact that she needed Republicans to vote to confirm her in the Senate. And she worked for Planned Parenthood when she was younger. She, in and this didn't even work is the other frustrating thing. She had one term in the House of Representatives in Oregon, and she was in a very moderate district, and so you could make the argument that she had to make some of these concessions in order to win, but she couldn't even win the election after that. So, but now she's been rewarded with it with a cabinet post, and all but three Republican senators voted to confirm her, and I think that was a mistake by them. I think they should have rejected this nomination. And, shout out to Mitch McConnell, to Rand Paul, and to Ted Budd, who were the three Republican senators who voted no.
Yeah, when CEI was presenting our agenda for Congress, we had Rand Paul with us, and he made a point of saying that he would not be voting to confirm that nomination at the time. All right, well, we got a bunch more we don't have time for. We'll have to circle back on RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Kristi Noem, and all the rest at a later date. But those are, I think, those are some good positioning statements on where we are with at least people who are influential into economic policy. So, uh, on to tariffs. Everyone's talking about tariffs. So the administration now for a while, I feel like, has been trying to soften up public opinion a while, where immediately after the election, Trump was saying a lot, that everything's going to improve right away, everything's going to be spectacular right away, all of his policies are going to be effective in a positive way right away. They're sort of pivoting from the idea that tariff policy is going to be immediately successful, at least economically, to saying, oh, well, you sort of led into that, when we were about Scott Bessent, his saying, well, maybe there'll be some transitional economic pain. Maybe there'll be a little downturn, maybe that, but eventually it'll be successful, is the argument. And so we'll magically transport the American economy back to 1955 or 1971 or whenever the good time was supposed to have been. Uh, so they are, I think they just released something this morning about how egg prices are coming down. And it's true, egg prices are coming down. But the Dow Jones Industrial Average has also come down by 10% in the past week or two, which is probably not so great. How do you think this is going to play out sort of politically or culturally? How much patience do you think the median swing voter is going to have with the uh, transitional economic pain for supposed long-term gain?
Well, look, the midterms are coming up in a year and a half at this point, and so if the transition takes longer than a year and a half, I think Republicans are going to hear about it at the ballot box pretty quickly. It's pretty rare for a party that wins the presidency to do well in the midterms right after. Anyway, there's usually sort of a natural pendulum swing the other way, but it could swing real hard if these policies get in the way of people's cost of living. And I put out some expectations of what I have for the tariffs. I don't think it's going to cause a meaningful increase in the inflation rate measured by the CPI or the PCE index, because tariffs, they don't increase the money supply. And so if you have a tariff on some goods, it's going to make those goods more expensive, but that's going to mean that there's going to be less spending somewhere else in the economy because people don't have more money in total to spend. So I wouldn't expect there to be total economy-wide inflation. So expect that to happen from a lot of the tariff supporters. If we don't see an inflation increase, they'll say, "Aha, we got you. There were no price increases because of the tariffs," and that's not going to be true. The price increases are going to show up in the specific goods to which those tariffs apply, but that doesn't mean it's going to show up as economy-wide inflation because there'll be less spending in other parts of the economy that aren't affected by tariffs. And we got to remember too, the point of tariffs is to raise prices. That is what they're for. If you want to have a protective tariff anyway, if you want to protect American industry, if you want to encourage people to buy American goods and not buy foreign goods, you have to raise the price of those foreign goods. That is what a tariff does. If you want to protect domestic industry. So when these guys say that, oh, this isn't about raising prices, it's not going to raise prices. if they actually believe that's true, then that means that their protective mission is not going to work. Because
Mhm.
if the prices don't go up for foreign goods, people are going to keep buying the foreign goods just like they do right now, and it's not going to make any difference for the domestic industries that they're trying to benefit. The inconvenient political part of tariffs is that people actually notice when prices go up. It's not a, it's the political problem for tariffs is not from businesses coming in and asking for special favors. That's the point of tariffs. That's what they're for. It's to keep businesses coming to the government, asking for the government's help, so that the government can pick and choose which ones it wants to benefit and which ones it wants to harm. And the annoying consumers complaining about prices getting higher. That's the political problem with tariffs. That's what's getting in the way of the government trying to execute its tariff strategy.
So, you know, the amount of money that I have to spend on consumer goods that maybe are subject to tariffs might impact my retirement savings somewhat. And I've been thinking about retirement savings ever since last week. I was here at Washington, D.C. at a very fancy event hosted by mega asset management firm BlackRock, every conservative activist's favorite corporation. Uh, so they had a big event about retirement and the public policy implications of how do we encourage people to save more for retirement. And there were a bunch of speakers, including CEO Larry Fink himself, and JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon. It was an A-list event. And on the one hand, BlackRock obviously has an interest in more people saving for retirement because they're an asset management company and they can like set up an account for you and that's their business. But they also maybe have an interest in supporting various ideological political positions, and they've been gotten a lot of criticism for that in the past. Besides just providing financial services. But I noticed two of their speakers. There's one kind of panel of two guys were representatives from two big labor unions talking about how we need to bring back defined benefit pensions for workers. And not just for, I mean, especially for union workers in their view, but not just for union workers. So one of them was a public sector guy who was a firefighter, and he represented the firefighters union. And then the other guy was a private sector guy who's a building trades guy, and he represented those guys. And they both said that was their number one, in wide ranging comments. Their number one thing was that absolutely need defined benefit pensions back. Again, those are the ones where you get a specific amount every month when you retire. That's not necessarily tied to how much you put in, whereas most of what we have now, which is 401ks and IRAs, which is we usually put a specific amount aside every month, and then how much you get at the end depends on how well your investments did. I know you've written about this. Should we be bringing back defined benefit pensions?
No. Defined benefit pensions are bad for workers. They're good for unions. They're good for union bosses, because it gives them giant pots of money that they can do whatever they want with. And they did for decades. They did whatever they want with these, and the result was that they didn't have enough money to pay out the benefits that were promised. So this thing that was supposed to be this like rock solid guarantee for workers actually ended up not being that. And rather than in the situation of a defined contribution plan where you have an account with your name on it, where you own the contents of that account and the fund manager has a fiduciary responsibility to you to get the best return that they can, you don't have that in a defined benefit pension plan. There is no account with your name on it. You're just counting on the fund managers actually doing their jobs, which they have all sorts of reasons to not do when there are union corruption going on in all sorts of different ways. And so what the Biden administration did as part of the American Rescue Plan Act is they just gave these union pension funds $86 billion of taxpayer money with no strings attached. Did not have to reform the programs at all. Just 100% free money from the taxpayer that will never be paid back. Doesn't have to be, isn't even expected to be paid back, in order to shore up these plans for another decade or 2 decades. There was a reason that we got away from defined benefit pension plans. And it is exactly this problem, which is that when the bill comes due and workers find out that they've been lied to, they go to the taxpayers and they say, "Hey, look, this isn't fair to us." And government's usually going to be sympathetic to that because it isn't fair to the workers that they were lied to for decades by unions and by the pension funds. And so taxpayers come in and foot the bill. So, even at the peak of defined benefit pensions, which was around the early 1970s, only about 2 in 5 workers even had access to one. So the idea that like everyone used to have these is just not true. Even at their most popular, 60% of American workers did not even have access to one. And of the ones who did have access, many of them were stuck in vesting periods that could last 10, 15, 20 years where they're not actually entitled to any benefits. They're just paying into the system and they have to keep the same job for, a decade or more in order to ever receive any benefits when they retire. And that's the only way you can get the math for these things to work is if you keep if you restrict the number of people who can actually receive the benefits by forcing them to work a long time. We don't want people to be tied to their jobs because of health insurance benefits. That's a big problem we have right now. It used to also be a problem that people were tied to their job for their retirement benefits too. We've sort of have mostly solved that problem, but we still have the problem with health insurance, which I think most people recognize is a problem. And it used to be the same way with retirement, but going to defined contribution helped us to get out of that, add flexibility to the labor market, so that workers could actually go where their skills are most needed and where they can best put to work their talents and get paid the most for it. So yeah, I think unions have a very self-interested reason to be asking for this. And we got to remember only 6% of American workers are members of a labor union. Even in those blue collar trades, like you mentioned, things like manufacturing sector, 92% of American manufacturing workers are not union members. 90% of American construction workers are not union members. Unions simply are not all that relevant to most Americans' lives, unless, of course, you work for the government, in which case about a third of government workers are unionized.
All right. And so when it comes to workers, when you say the word workers, usually people imagine someone with a hard hat, a high vis vest, someone with work gloves on. You know, work is so culturally connected to physical labor that I feel like it's a little people get a little confused because not everyone who has a job obviously does that sort of job, but even people like us who are laptop workers sometimes have that image in the back of our mind all the time that like all about American labor, everything is all about using wrenches. Um, and so when we look at what is the U.S. economy, what does the U.S. labor force look like in the 21st century, we have, you could look at the classic dichotomy. We have goods and services, right? So we have physical stuff that you make and sell to people, and then you've got services, whether that's you're a waiter or you're an accountant or you're a management consultant or you're the CEO of BlackRock. You could be on the service side, and you know one thing you emphasized that I noticed was about trade deficits. When we talk about does the U.S. have a trade deficit with this country or that country? We usually look at physical products and we count those exports across borders, not say like professional services. And and so I wonder, is this the sort of focus on goods versus services is just sort of just kind of an artifact about how economic analysis has been always been done because 100 years ago much more of the economy was physical stuff? Or is there also some sort of deeper kind of social psychology and how we talk about this? Because it seems like the populist critique of the modern economy and why we have all I think a lot of the politics around economic and industrial policy that we do is that making goods is based and good, and services is cringe and soy, to use contemporary internet slang. Is that kind of where we are?
Yeah, I think it's both those things that you mentioned. I mean, part of it is a just historical artifact of the time in which a lot of our economic statistic keeping started. So, most of our national accounting system comes from the 1930s, during the Great Depression. That's where we sort of standardized how we calculate GDP. It's where we started doing a lot of the labor force statistics and things like that. And so a lot of those categories, like for example, like the most obvious example of it, I think, in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is they still separate out the farm economy and the non-farm economy, even though nowadays the farm economy is like 1% of GDP. And the non-farm is 99%. It doesn't really make very much sense for that to be the first distinction. But back then it did make more sense, right? Because farming was a much bigger part of the economy. I think it's a similar thing, like you mentioned, with goods and services. There's, a lot of state sales taxes also started during the Great Depression, and as a result, most state sales taxes apply to goods, and they don't apply to services, or at least they don't apply to all services. And so one of the problems that states have had for decades now is the erosion of their sales tax base, because as people spend more on services relative to goods, the amount of stuff that's subject to the sales tax has gone down, and really sales taxes should include all consumption, whether it's goods or services. And so, I think there's plenty of examples where it is just a failure to keep up with the times. But then I do think there is that psychological component too, where people feel like something that's tangible that you can touch is inherently better than things that you can't touch. But I think you can look at parallels from a previous economic transition, right? The transition from agriculture to industry. We see this all over the world. Basically, every country, as it develops, they start with agriculture, then they go to industry, and then they go to services. And because the United States is, probably the world's most developed and diversified economy, we're very much in the services stage. If you look at places like China, which are, middle income countries, they're very much in the industry stage. If you look at places that are very poor, places like Cambodia, they're still very much in the agriculture stage, right? So that progression really goes for every country, and there's really not anything you can do about it because it really is just a reflection of people's preferences as they become wealthier. So if you look at that first transition from agriculture to industry in the United States and in the UK, the places where it happened first, you could hear a lot of people making similar arguments about how, oh, this is terrible to have people, separated from the land. It was better when people were tied to the land because it keeps them, grounded in their country and the source of their food, and separating, having them move to the cities and work in factories is dehumanizing and is inherently worse than working on farms. And yet, people did it. Of course, there were plenty of terrible conditions in a lot of these factories and things. But what this industrialization allowed us to do was it allowed us to become richer, to clean up that stuff, and to move on to bigger and better things. And so I think you see a lot of this same style of argument right now. Who knows what the next stage will be after services? I don't know. But there will probably be something after that as well. And you'll hear all the same stuff, 150, 200 years from now. People will be saying, "Oh, those good service jobs, these were better than whatever comes next." It's terrible, dehumanizing to be taking people out of these great service jobs. And you already have that with the factories, with sort of factory jobs, right? A lot of the same traditionalist type of people were very critical of factory jobs in the early 1900s because they thought this was terrible. Now you hear the factory jobs were good, and actually we need to have more of them. It's a very I think it's a very historically contingent thing that we hear a lot, and I wouldn't put too much stock into it, because if you take that more historical perspective, I think you can see a lot of parallels in that actually it's good for society to get richer, because that's how, just by definition, that's how we reduce poverty, but that's also how we get all of the other things that we want in a good life. And you need economic development for that to happen.
Yeah, I think when some of our thought leaders are writing their essays from Mars colony in 100 years, they'll be saying, "Oh, it was really the pinnacle of Western civilization was when people were, you know, consulting associates at McKinsey, and and once we lost those consulting associate jobs, then society really went downhill." Um, but yeah, well, to go back to our agrarian roots for a second, um, the most based and virtuous of all America's beautiful farmers. Um, I wonder, here's sort of a case study here, to the extent that farmers kind of do have a sort of, even though, people who work directly in farming, like you said, is only like a couple percent of the economy, where it used to be a huge percent. Farmers definitely have a certain kind of cultural cachet in American history, right? And talking about how farmers are good and important, and we do love our farming friends. But because they have a kind of very specific cultural legacy, they have a kind of special status in policy decisions, right? We have a whole U.S. Department of Agriculture, whereas if you were creating the U.S. government from scratch of nothing, would we even have a Department of Agriculture? Like, we already have a Department of Commerce. Would we create a whole cabinet department for 1% of the economy? So all of that is just a lead in to say, I think the farming and agriculture in the U.S. could be an interesting test case for how the Trump 2.0 tariffs, circling back to the beginning, are end up impacting us. Because the first time around, uh, uh, the administration didn't have quite as many tariffs in quite as many places, but we did have tariffs on China. China uh, imported a lot of U.S. agricultural products, including soybeans, and as retribution, or retaliation, the Chinese put a bunch of tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports, and that hurt a lot of American farmers, especially farmers who are in soy. And there are, even though, again, in internet slang, the term soy is considered to be an insult, there are soybeans are actually a very valuable agricultural commodity in the United States, and there's a lot of American farmers who make their living off of it. And so, what the administration did when the farmers went to, Trump 1.0 and said, "Hey, we're really getting hurt here by these retaliatory tariffs from China." They said, "Oh, well, no problem. We'll just give you direct subsidies." And so they spent something like 25, $30 billion subsidizing American farmers who were hurt by retaliatory tariffs, which seems to maybe have undermined the value of having put tariffs to Chinese goods in the first place. So, do we think we're going to see like a repeat of that? Because the administration is already sort of prepping for retaliatory tariffs. In fact, their own tariff policy is premised on being retaliatory. Um, and if, farming specifically, but obviously this could extend to other sectors as well. If, we're getting higher prices for imports and we're protecting our domestic producers, and we're also trying to, put that money into deficit reduction or whatever, how valuable is that going to be if we then have to turn around and pay it all back to domestic producers who are hurt by counter tariffs in the first place?
Yeah, this is one of the costs of tariffs. It's not just the higher prices that Americans have to pay. It's the stuff that the government has to do on the back end to clean up its own mess. This is exactly what happened in the first term. Like you said, they spent 25 to 30 billion dollars bailing out farmers. That was larger than the entire budget of the Department of Agriculture at that time. And guess what? The Department of Agriculture has not shrunk since then, at least significantly. It still is much, much bigger than it was before these policies were put in place. And you mentioned the sort of the fond feeling that we have for farmers, and this seems to be a pretty universal thing as well. You could look all the way back to Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith is talking about, he's sort of is very poetic when he talks about farming. And obviously we should be grateful to the people who grow our food. That's really important.
Mhm.
And it's really, really, and it is an industry that the United States excels at. Um, but it is also the case that it's one of our most socialistic industries. The Department of Agriculture has in place price supports, specific commodity boards, and things like that would, fit in place in the Soviet Union. And a big part of the reason for that is that some of them during the New Deal was actually modeled on the Soviet Union. And so a lot of these policies, like we were saying before, are very outdated. We have a federal egg board that seeks to promote the consumption of eggs, even though, as we have seen from the last couple years, Americans have no problems with demand for eggs. That seems to be a pretty well done thing, and I don't think it's because of the federal egg board. I think it's because people just like to eat eggs, and but we still have that. We have all sorts of pricing formulas for milk and things like that that end up encouraging tons and tons of waste because they keep the price, they try to increase the price of milk, which encourages farmers to produce more than is actually needed, and then a whole bunch of it just gets poured down the drain. So we have lots of things in place like that. And so really the bailouts because of the tariffs is just it's just one additional government support on top of lots of government supports that are already there. And Cato Institute did a really interesting report. They sent a investigative reporter out to talk to some farmers. And yeah, if you talk to farmers, what they'll tell you is like, we're kind of sick of having the government telling us what to do with our land. We're kind of sick of being told to not grow things. We're farmers. We want to grow things. That's our job. But the Department of Agriculture will continue to do this because it's part of it, partly just because it's what we've always done, and it's hard to change things that have been around for 100 years. But also because it allows politicians to go out and say, "Look what I'm doing for the farmers. Don't you love those guys, voters?" And then the voters go, "Yeah, we do," and then they vote for you. So I think that's part of it as well.
So maybe we could make "Liberate the Farmers" the new rallying cry.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would also like to say that the USDA does, again, a lot of these sort of like legacy programs that date back to the Great Depression. They could probably do without, but they do have a giant limestone cavern in Missouri where there's 1.4 billion pounds of cheese, and
Hmm.
I would like to go on a tour of the giant cheese cave. Maybe it's not the most libertarian thing in the world, but I would like to see that cave and
Yeah.
possibly eat some cheese. Um, all right, Dominic, this has been a fantastic conversation, covering a lot of great stuff. And I didn't mention in my intro, but of course, you are a part of a very elite fraternity of multiple episode Free the Economy guests. So I want to thank you very much for coming back for round two. And before we go, tell everyone where they can find all your stuff online.
Yeah, so you can find my pieces at nationalreview.com. I'd encourage you to subscribe to NR Plus. It's our digital subscription. Very good deal for first-time subscribers, especially. And that gets you full access to everything on the website. It makes a lot of the ads go away. It really improves the experience, and it helps us to keep the lights on, pay the bills. You can find me on Twitter at Dominic J Pino, and then anywhere you get podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you can find Econception, which is my podcast with the American Institute for Economic Research. We do 2 episodes a month, talking usually with a guest, and then sometimes it's just me, but usually with a guest, and then also just some talking about econ current events. So that's Econception. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts.
All right. Excellent. Thanks again, Dominic.
Thank you.